What's going on, Vital MTB? Today, we're taking a look at the all-new Rocky Mountain Altitude and comparing it with the Santa Cruz Megatower. There's been a lot of talk about how similar these two bikes look, but I've been lucky enough to spend time on both, and in this video, I want to run through some of the finer details and talk about what sets them apart. So let's get into it. With pretty similar frame layouts, let's start with some details of the two bikes. The Santa Cruz Megatower rolls on 29-inch wheels and has 165 millimeters of rear wheel travel with a 170 millimeter fork. The Rocky Mountain Altitude also rolls on 29-inch wheels, but with 160 millimeters of rear wheel travel and a 170 millimeter fork. Both bikes have adjustable geometry. Santa Cruz keeps things simple with a high and low geometry flip chip in the lower link. The Altitude has a flip chip in the lower link too, but it is used to switch between mixed wheels or full 29. Rocky Mountain takes things a few steps further when it comes to geometry adjustments with their 4-position Ride 4 flip chip found in the forward shock mount. Reach numbers can also be adjusted up to 10 millimeters with interchangeable headset cups. Both bikes have shock tunnels for the lower link-driven suspension and nice little fenders to protect the shock stanchion. The Megatower uses the tried and true VPP platform, while the Altitude features an all-new LC2R platform with a concentric lower link that rotates around the bottom bracket shell. Beyond the visual similarities, I wanted to set up both bikes as similarly as possible to help eliminate as many factors that would impact handling and performance. I'm quite familiar with the Megatower and have gotten pretty comfortable with the way it rides, but was less comfortable on the Altitude ahead of this test while riding it in the stock configuration. I'd already opted for the shorter headset cup position, but was surprised to find position 4 on the Ride 4 adjustment put the front triangle dimensions identically in line with the Megatower, matching the 63.8 degree head tube angle, 77.8 degree seat tube angle, and putting the bottom bracket height within a half a millimeter of each other, which got me thinking, are these actually the same bike? Jokes aside, this helped tremendously with my comfort on the bike, and I felt immediately at home with the handling characteristics. On the topic of suspension and component spec, these bikes both use the same 230 by 65 millimeter RockShox Super Deluxe Ultimate rear shock. Both shocks achieve 30% sag with the same 268 psi inside, so I matched damper settings to further eliminate factors and did the same with each fork. Both have a 170mm RockShox Zeb up front and use equivalent level 12-speed drivetrains with 4-piston brakes. While the Megatower is blinged out with axis shifting and an ultimate level fork in comparison to the Altitude's Select Plus fork and DRXT group set, shifting performance wasn't a concern, and the Select Plus fork has the same level of adjustment as an Ultimate, only without the buttercups in the lower leg. Both bikes have the same Maxxis Assegai and Minion DHR2 tire combo in their Max Grip compound. Both mounted to 30mm internal width aluminum rims, and both bikes were set up with 35mm aluminum handlebars. By controlling as many variables as possible around bike setup, I focused on 3 primary categories when analyzing descending performance. The first being handling characteristics, which analyze how each bike responds to rider input and how differences in geometry relate. The second, rear suspension performance, focusing on how the kinematics of each bike absorb or transmit velocities from the trail through the bike. And lastly, frame construction, comparing how stiff or compliant each frame feels. Starting off with the handling characteristics of these bikes, the Megatower is sort of my baseline for a bike that handles well, and it unsurprisingly felt as precise as I remembered. Standing on the bike, I felt best when leaning forward into the bars, as my natural weight bias felt slightly rearward when standing in a neutral position. It was easy to put the bike on any line and yielded an immediate response to my input when pumping, jumping, and changing direction because I felt like I always knew what the wheels were doing beneath me. The bike carried a light feeling on trail, and the feeling remained consistent across nearly any kind of terrain. This made it a bit more difficult to ride relaxed and aggressive terrain, as the bike had a tendency to pitch front to back a little more heavily through undulations. On the flip side, it was super rewarding when riding with a higher level of confidence, and the bike felt more composed when pushing. What stood out most about the handling characteristic of the Megatower was the consistency in response to rider input. This made riding aggressive very enjoyable. Taking a look at how the Altitude handles on trail, the longer dimensions are immediately apparent, and my weight felt significantly more centered in the bike. Leaning forward into the bars, like on the Megatower, resulted in a light feeling at the rear wheel, but shifting my weight rearward helped create more even pressure at both wheels. The longer chainstays helped in maintaining plenty of front wheel traction even when hanging off the back, but the bike carried a very stuck-to-the-ground feeling and absorbed a fair amount of rider input. That absorption of input meant there was a favorable level of resistance to pull against while cornering. This helped when leaning hard to tighten up turns. Movements felt a bit delayed in comparison to the Megatower, but it also eliminated much more feedback from the trail, which helped keep things calm through choppy undulations and made it easy to forget what kind of terrain I was running into. The standout characteristic of the Altitude's handling was the comfort across all terrain types. This made the bike easy to hold onto and inspired confidence early into testing. The way each of these bikes handles can be related to the way they use their travel and how the suspension reacts at different velocities. The rear suspension of the Megatower took the initial edge off bumps well, but firmed up rather quickly to build support early in the travel. This contributed to the light handling of the bike and created a nearly trail bike feeling on mellow terrain where having a solid platform to push into was enjoyable for jibs and jumps of all sizes. When tackling more aggressive terrain, feedback through the bike became more apparent at a cruising pace, but at high speed seemed to dissipate much more. The bike felt like it accelerated through successive hits rather than hanging up, and the kinematic did a great job controlling higher velocities from the rear wheel to keep the shock from getting too far through its stroke. This helped the bike maintain more natural geometry through its travel, and it always felt like there was a safety net waiting at the end of the travel if things didn't go as planned. Where the Megatower creates that safety net feeling sooner in the travel, the Altitude throws one out within the first 2/3 of travel. Consistent with the stable handling characteristics of the bike, the rear suspension ate at bumps of every shape and size to help create this safe and stable feeling. Also consistent is the way the bike seems to absorb more rider input. The kinematic of the LC2R platform is super supple off the top and builds support later in the last third of travel, but this made it a little more difficult to get off the ground. The bike ramps up heavily to prevent bottom out, which did a great job of slowing these higher shaft speeds, but in some instances fell a bit too late to prevent them from transmitting through my feet. This made the suspension feel less settled when attacking the most aggressive terrain, but the geometry helped keep the bike on track in these instances. Overall, the suspension felt less fatiguing than the Megatower. Consistent with the immediate build and support from the rear suspension, the frame construction of the Megatower also provides a ton of support. There's a small amount of compliance built in, just enough to make things comfortable, but the solid foundation of the frame certainly contributed to the rewarding feeling of riding the bike with higher levels of input. This also contributes to the higher level of feedback felt through the bike and proved to be less forgiving when things didn't go as planned. While comfort suffers slightly, it's something worth sacrificing for the incredibly predictable handling of the bike. The Altitude's frame construction felt fairly supple on trail, but built a good amount of support as I leaned into it. The off-the-top flex was rather apparent, making rough bits of trail less fatiguing, and proved to be especially beneficial in off-camber sections where it felt effortless to hold a line across routes. I anticipated the lateral flex to have an adverse effect while cornering under heavy loading. It felt a bit unpredictable and took some getting used to, but the frame ramps up heavily under torsional forces and allowed me to lean in as hard as I like to make a consistent arc in turns. As mentioned, the delayed handling came more from the dimensions of the bike, but the additional frame compliance contributed as well. This wasn't necessarily a bad thing though. I found myself leaning earlier into turns than on the Megatower in order to load the frame more gradually, but the benefit was that I could actually lean for longer because of how much traction is on tap. That about sums up descending performance, so I'll run through which bike excelled in each category. For overall handling characteristics, the geometry of the Megatower felt a bit twitchy at times, which was fun for playful riding, but it felt a bit less stable in the gnarly stuff, and the front wheel had a tendency to feel light at times. The Altitude handles similar enough, but with significantly more traction at both wheels, so it wins in this category. Looking at rear suspension performance, the rear suspension of the Altitude was very supple off the top and smoothed out the trail a ton, but it also made the bike hard to get off the ground and ramped harshly towards the end of its travel in some instances. The way the Megatower builds support early in the travel was awesome and felt more composed when charging, so it wins this category. While the Altitude was super comfortable and the additional frame flex helped create a ton of traction in less supported sections of trail, I felt like it also absorbed a fair amount of rider input. I like to tighten up turns at a moment's notice, jump off of side hits with questionable landings, and the stiffer construction of the Megatower seemed to feel best in these instances, so it wins this category as well. While the primary focus of this test was descending performance, I also analyzed pedaling performance just for good measure. Both bikes provide what I would describe as an adequate level of pedaling performance for an enduro bike, nothing ultra-light or snappy, but certainly not cumbersome when pointed uphill. Body position on the Altitude felt slightly more forward while seated, and the Megatower put me more upright. The Megatower had a slight advantage because of its shorter dimensions, allowing for better maneuverability. Power transfer also felt more direct from the firmer suspension platform of the Megatower, while the Altitude had slightly more bob. The trade-off is that the Altitude provided a smoother ride over small bumps, but did seem to absorb some of the power transfer. Looking at durability, it wasn't necessarily a long enough test period to determine long-term durability, but provided enough time to foresee a few problem areas. On the Megatower, The lower down tube protection is made of hard plastic and has a gap between it and the frame in one portion, which cracked and lost a piece at some point in the time I've had the bike. While it's easily replaceable with only 2 bolts holding it in place, it would be a bit annoying to continually replace them over the lifetime of the bike. The Altitude posed a more serious concern with the lower link finding its way loose after my second ride on the bike and caused a fair amount of free play within the linkage. Thankfully, Rocky Mountain provides a tool that uses a 6mm Allen wrench to tighten the interface to the recommended 25 Nm. I opted to use low-strength blue Loctite on the threads to prevent any future slipping. Unfortunately, the problem resurfaced after 2 more rides and seemed to arise in instances where loading the bike heavily side to side was more frequent. Upon retorquing the main pivot, I noticed a discrepancy in the torque specs that could be a root cause. The 35 to 55 Nm torque range of the Shimano threaded bottom bracket cup surpasses the 25 Nm of torque on the pivot hardware. Being housed behind the drive side cup, which uses left-hand threads, the right-hand threaded main pivot ring spins with the bottom bracket shell as it tightens and results in a loss of torque until enough pressure builds between the two to keep it from spinning any further. I tried slightly less torque on the bottom bracket for my second attempt, but the problem persisted and poses a concern when looking at bearing life and cost of ownership. It seems a left-hand threaded sleeve for this main pivot would be a viable solution as an update to solve this, but perhaps there is more than meets the eye as to why Rocky hasn't done this. So what's the bottom line? Well, these bikes are both great enduro bikes, but I think they may serve 2 different purposes in my mind. As for where I would spend my money on a daily driver to ride terrain I'm very familiar with, I would go with the Megatower, no question. It's super predictable, maybe a bit less stable in less familiar instances, but certainly more playful, and I feel like I can deal with that day to day. As for an enduro race bike, I think the Altitude is the obvious choice. I felt super confident riding less familiar terrain, and the level of comfort would be really beneficial over the course of a couple days racing. As for everyday riding, I think I would get tired of the stuck to the ground feeling, but for racing it's always appreciated. The durability concerns are a factor that would keep me from wanting it as my daily driver, but if it's being used as a race bike, I think taking things apart to clean and retorque is less of an issue and more of a good idea anyways. So there you have it, both very similar bikes, both awesome for different reasons. Hopefully this gives you all an idea of what to look for based on your personal needs. For even more info, be sure to check out the main article over at vitalmtb.com, and we'll see you next time.